He wasn't draped in luxury or flashing a gold card. Just a black man with steady eyes and a boarding pass crumpled at the edges, standing in the hush that always fell when people decided someone didn't belong. No need for slurs when a smirk would do. No shoving required when you could fence someone out with a "Well-placed, sir, please wait." That simple uniformed voice carried the weight of ownership, slicing the line between those welcome to recline in leather and those forced to justify their presence at all. He didn't yell. He didn't demand. But the silence he left behind would cost them more than any ticket ever could. This isn't just about a seat. It's about the price of assuming you can deny someone their dignity without consequence. Like what you're hearing? Tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment about your thoughts. Tell us where you're watching from. I want to know who's tuning in for the whole ride. Ellis Morrow hadn't planned to make trouble. He didn't even want to be noticed. He wore old jeans, the knees faded white, a navy windbreaker zipped to his chin against the airport chill, and battered white sneakers whose soles were starting to peel. He shifted from foot to foot in line, gripping the boarding pass like it might fly away. It was his insurance against humiliation, or so he thought. First Class 1A printed clearly in block letters. He had checked it 3 times already, obsessively, the ink smudged at one corner from his thumb. His eyes burned with exhaustion from the long layover, but he straightened when they announced boarding. First-class passengers were called with smooth, practiced authority over the intercom. His pulse thudded in his ears. He took one breath to steady himself and stepped forward. That's when he noticed the flight attendant watching him. Corinna Doyle, mid-40s, flawless hair pulled back in a perfect twist, crisp uniform without a single wrinkle, nameplate gleaming in the overhead lights. She had been smiling just moments before. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Latham. Enjoy the champagne." Her voice had been warm, delighted, as the white couple ahead of him beamed back. She even handed them boarding chocolates with a conspiratorial wink. But when Ellis approached, that warmth drained away, replaced with a tight, businesslike composure that didn't bother to hide the suspicion in her eyes. She let her gaze drift, slow and deliberate, from the fraying cuff of his windbreaker to the scuffed sneakers to the cheap duffel slung over one shoulder. When she finally met his eyes again, her professional smile had flattened into a thin line. He offered his boarding pass automatically, polite, voice careful. "Good evening. First class." She didn't take it. She kept her hands folded in front of her waist like a bouncer. "Next," she chirped, voice bright and friendly, but the command aimed past him to the people behind. He blinked, not understanding. "Sorry," he asked softly. Her eyes narrowed, mouth twisting in false patience. "Sir," she said, tone dropping like a lead weight. "You'll need to wait. Don't crowd the line." He felt something in his gut seize, but he tried again. "I'm first class. 1A." He extended the ticket an inch further, willing her to look at it, to see the truth printed there. She exhaled, loudly, clearly, a sigh that said she'd been forced to deal with this all day. Without shifting her feet, she snatched the pass between 2 fingers, like it was unclean. She squinted at it as if it were a fake. "Uh-huh," she said dismissively, not bothering to hide the smirk in her voice. She turned it over unnecessarily, the pause painfully long, making sure everyone behind Ellis could see she was checking it. Then she didn't hand it back. She tucked it to her side and smiled over Ellis's shoulder. "Next," she called again, voice syrupy sweet. The man behind Ellis, wearing a $500 fleece pullover and carrying a premium laptop case, hesitated, glancing between them. Corinna waved him forward with a wink. "Don't be shy, Mr. Holt." He squeezed past Ellis without a word, careful not to meet his eyes, his jaw tight in embarrassment on Ellis's behalf, or maybe annoyance at the delay. Ellis felt the heat flush up his neck, prickling under his collar. He tried to keep his voice even. "Please. That's my seat." She didn't bother to look at him now. She was too busy beaming at the couple behind Holt. "Welcome aboard, Dr. and Mrs. Simmons. Right this way." When they smiled, she laughed. She even touched Mrs. Simmons's arm in a show of easy intimacy. Ellis watched it all, his boarding pass now held hostage in her hand. The line behind him twisted in impatient confusion. He heard a child whining. The mother shushed them sharply and glared at Ellis like he was to blame. He could feel the eyes on him, burning holes in his back, the weight of their judgment pressing him down. He tried to speak again, but his mouth felt dry. Finally, he managed, low and raw. He told himself to stay calm. Don't make it worse. Don't make them right. But before he could gather enough courage to speak up again, Karenna glanced his way with that same cold, hard smile that never touched her eyes. Then she did something worse than ignoring him. She turned her entire body, so her voice would carry to everyone waiting. "Sorry everyone, hold on," she called loudly, bright and clear, her hand raised in mock apology to the crowd. "He's making things difficult." Ellis flinched. The words stabbed through him, sharp and casual, designed to hurt while sounding professional. She hadn't even bothered to look at him as she said it, as though he weren't really there, as though he was just an obstacle she needed to clear for the paying customers behind him. The effect was instant. The low hum of impatient conversation behind him went sharp, buzzing. He heard the distinct, irritated sigh of a woman 2 spots back. Another man actually muttered "Jesus Christ" under his breath. A kid asked too loudly, "Mommy, why is he in trouble?" And the mother shushed them while glaring at Ellis, eyes narrowed with instant judgment. Ellis felt the flush rise up his neck into his cheeks, his ears burning. His pulse thudded in his temples. He tried to speak, but the words turned to dry cotton in his mouth. Karenna hadn't finished humiliating him. She dropped her voice only slightly, so it was all the more dramatic, sighing with exaggerated patience as she scanned the line. "We can't let people just wander into first class," she explained to the gathered crowd, shaking her head like a disappointed teacher lecturing unruly children. She let the pause hang there. Her words were clear enough, the meaning unmistakable. She was protecting them from him. Ellis felt like he was shrinking in real time, as if the duffel on his shoulder weighed 100 pounds, as if the cheap windbreaker might melt into the floor to hide him. He couldn't seem to move, couldn't seem to force himself to walk away and spare himself the stares. He felt pinned in place by their collective gaze, as though everyone was waiting for him to prove Karenna right by exploding or arguing. But he didn't. He stayed there, breathing too hard, forcing himself to swallow the words that fought to climb up his throat. He watched the woman with the designer bag, the one who had scowled at him before, lean into the businessman in the trench coat and whisper something with her lips twisted in disgust. The businessman didn't bother to whisper back. "Can you believe this shit?" he said aloud. He wasn't talking to Ellis. He was talking about him. Karenna heard it. She didn't react except to give a brief, thin smile of agreement. She didn't need to say anything else. She had already told them what to think. She turned back to her scanner, checking the next person's ticket with a renewed cheerfulness that felt like a slap. "Thank you so much for your patience," she said, voice lilting like music. "We'll get you on in just a sec." She actually winked at the next passenger, a tall man in an expensive-looking blazer, who responded with a tight-lipped, polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes because even he could sense the tension. Ellis's breathing hitched. He realized he was squeezing the strap of his duffel so hard his fingers were numb. He forced himself to ease the grip, but the shaking didn't stop. The ticket, the proof that he belonged there, was still held in Karenna's hand, though she now rested it casually against the scanner like it was a prop in her performance. He tried again, voice cracking despite his best efforts. "Please," he managed. One word. That was all he could get out. Karenna didn't even flinch. She didn't look at him. She just kept talking to the next person in line, raising her voice to ensure the line behind could hear the story she wanted them to believe. "I'm sorry for the hold up," she said with a sweet sigh. He watched as she waved the last passenger past, all smiles and light banter about the meal service waiting for them, before finally, turning back to him. But she didn't address him directly. Instead, she lifted her hand in a little signal behind her, a flick of her wrist that summoned help like a queen calling for servants to clear the rabble. He realized too late what she was doing. From the side of the gate counter emerged another uniform, this one dark navy with gold trim. Brad Kinney, the gate manager, broad-chested, older, a paunch pushing against his belt. jolly face shiny under the harsh overhead lights, and eyes that went instantly cold and assessing as they landed on Ellis. He hadn't even spoken yet, but Ellis felt his heart sink, as if someone had grabbed it and pushed it down into his gut. Brad didn't even bother to greet him. He turned slightly to Karenna first, voice pitched just low enough that Ellis could barely hear him. "What seems to be the problem here?" Karenna gave a dramatic, weary sigh, but her eyes glittered. "He's refusing to wait in line. He keeps insisting he's first class, but he's not letting the other guests board." The words hit Ellis like a slap, so carefully chosen, so smoothly delivered, transforming his desperation to be treated fairly into belligerence. Brad turned to Ellis with slow, heavy condescension, his lips pressed into a line that wasn't even trying to be polite. "Sir," he drawled, tone measured like he was explaining simple math to a toddler. "If you don't comply, we'll have to remove you." Ellis felt the words slam into him, the threat of security shining behind them like a blade drawn in a back alley. He tried again, voice raw. "My ticket says first class. 1A. She has it in her hand." He didn't even try to hide the shake in his voice anymore. He was too tired, too exposed. Brad didn't look at the ticket. He didn't even glance at Karenna's hand, where it sat pinched like evidence of his crime. He just shifted closer, using his size to loom. "Look," he said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hush that still carried to everyone nearby. "This is for paying customers. We have protocols. Please don't make a scene." Ellis recoiled as if struck, the words turning to bile in his mouth. Paying customers. As though he'd hopped the turnstile at a subway station. As though he hadn't worked overtime for weeks, scrimped on groceries, skipped nights out just to afford that one goddamn seat, so he could get home without hunching his spine into coach for 4 hours. His mouth fell open, but no sound came out. He searched Brad's face for some hint of fairness, but all he saw was blank corporate disdain. Brad didn't care what the ticket said. He'd already made up his mind about Ellis the second he saw the clothes, the skin, the posture that now radiated embarrassment. Karenna shifted behind Brad, her mouth twisted in triumph she didn't bother to hide. She didn't have to say anything else. She'd won the moment she called for help. Ellis swallowed hard, trying to keep the tears from spilling, feeling the ache in his jaw from clenching it too tight. Brad stepped even closer, voice dropping further, somehow more menacing for being so calm. "We can do this the easy way, sir," he murmured. "Or we can involve airport security. Your choice." Ellis flinched visibly, a muscle in his cheek ticking. Security. That was the word meant to end all arguments. He glanced over Brad's shoulder and saw the uniformed guard at the far end of the gate area, shifting slightly as though he already sensed he might be needed. Ellis felt the moment slip. He felt the choice drain away. If he fought, they'd drag him out in front of everyone. He knew how that story ended. It would be him in handcuffs on someone's phone, another viral clip of an angry black man causing trouble, while Karenna cried on cue about how threatened she felt. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Please," he whispered. "Just scan it. That's all." Brad straightened, eyes flicking to Karenna with a smirk that Ellis barely caught before it vanished behind a mask of corporate patience. "I don't want to have to ask again," Brad said, louder this time for the audience. "Step aside. Let's not delay the other passengers." Karenna turned back to him with that practiced flight attendant smile curdling on her lips, her gaze hard and unblinking as she tilted her chin up ever so slightly to loom over him despite being half a head shorter. She raised her arm with slow, theatrical deliberation, palm out as if she were directing traffic. But the gesture had none of the professional courtesy she lavished on the other passengers. It was a dismissive shove without touching him. "Back up, sir." "Now," she snapped, voice pitched to Carrie, ensuring everyone around them heard the command and understood exactly who she was talking to. Ellis froze, the shame intensifying tenfold as the order rang in the air. He felt dozens of eyes flicked at him in a synchronized wave, scanning him from head to toe, judging, weighing. He swallowed once, his throat clicking dryly, wanting so badly to argue, to shout, to demand that she simply scan the damn ticket and treat him like any other first-class passenger. But he knew. God, he knew. His mother's voice in his head was loud and pleading. Don't you dare. Don't you give them the excuse they want. So instead, Ellis's feet shuffled backwards in small, uneven steps. He tried to keep his head up, but his gaze dropped to the floor as the humiliating scrape of his old sneakers on the linoleum broadcast his retreat to the entire waiting area. He ended up bumping lightly into the retractable rope barrier, the metal post rattling with a sharp clang that felt like the punchline to a joke he didn't get. A few people snickered quietly, the sound unmistakable, worming into his ears and settling in his chest like acid. Karenna didn't wait for him to recover. She lowered her arm, folded her hands neatly in front of her stomach, and let out an exasperated sigh that was practically a performance. "Thank you," she said with saccharine politeness, loud enough for the crowd to hear every word. Then she added, her voice taking on a mocking brightness that made Ellis flinch, "We have real customers waiting." That single sentence detonated like a bomb in his gut. He jerked his head up to meet her eyes for the first time since Brad had slithered back behind the counter, his own smirk fading only after the threat had landed. Karenna's gaze met his evenly, triumph flickering there like a cruel spark. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She wanted him to see it. She wanted him to know exactly what she meant. The line of passengers behind the rope rippled with uncomfortable movement. Some people shifted on their feet, avoiding his eyes. Others watched with barely contained fascination, like gawkers at a car wreck. A man in a business suit actually chuckled once, the sound dry and ugly, before quickly coughing to cover it when his companion elbowed him lightly. A mother in yoga pants pressed her child closer, the kid peering around her hip with wide, confused eyes. The teenager with earbuds and just shook his head and mouthed something that looked like dumbass before turning away. Ellis felt the words scraping raw in his throat, desperate to come out. He wanted to scream that he was a real customer, that he had saved for this, that he had the right to be treated the same as anyone else. But he didn't. He couldn't. He stood there, shoulders hunched, head lowered, breathing ragged as he fought to hold himself together, while the gate area felt quiet except for the persistent, low hum of the terminal beyond and the crisp, bright voice of Karenna resuming her performance. "Welcome aboard," she called cheerfully to the next first-class passenger, an older white woman with silver hair and an expensive scarf draped just so. The woman blinked at Ellis before quickly turning her eyes back to Karenna, who smiled wide, radiating service and care. "Let's get you to your seat. Thank you so much for your patience while we sorted that little issue." Ellis felt the heat crawl up his neck to the tips of his ears. That little issue. He was the issue. He was the delay, the obstacle, the one who had dared to stand where he didn't belong. The words repeated in his head with every heartbeat. He tried to move further back, but his duffel was heavy and his legs felt leaden, unwilling to obey. He managed a few jerky steps until he found himself practically pressed against the wall, as far from the boarding lane as he could get without leaving entirely. Karenna never looked back at him. She kept the line moving, one passenger after another. For each one, she was warm and welcoming. "Right this way, sir. Enjoy the extra legroom. Ma'am, you'll find the wine list in the menu pocket. Some fantastic vintages today. Oh, Dr. Lee, we're so pleased to have you back with us." The contrast was so stark it made Ellis dizzy. She was perfectly capable of charm. She was perfectly capable of respect, just not for him. Not for the man with the dark skin, the old shoes, the second-hand windbreaker zipped tight like armor that had already failed him. His eyes burned again, wetness threatening to betray him, but he blinked it away savagely. He would not cry here. He would not give them that satisfaction. But his chest ached from the effort. Brad had retreated to the counter to handle some paperwork, though Ellis caught the older man glancing over occasionally, ensuring the problem stayed in its place. He thought about leaving. God, he wanted to leave. Just turn around, walk out of the terminal, let the ticket go to waste, forget this ever happened. But then what? Wait overnight for another flight he couldn't afford? Sit in some hard plastic chair, watching the hours crawl by until he finally scraped together the courage to try again? He had to get home. He needed to get home. So he forced himself to stand there, waiting for even the slightest sign that Karenna might relent, that she might turn to him and say it was all a misunderstanding, that he really did belong in first class like any other passenger. But she didn't. She never even looked at him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ellis drew in a shaky breath and took a single step forward. The sound of his foot scuffing the floor was absurdly loud in the relative quiet. Karenna didn't turn immediately. She was busy handing another boarding pass back to a tall man in a crisp gray suit, who accepted it with a nod before walking past Ellis, without so much as a glance. When the man was gone, Ellis cleared his throat. It sounded too loud and too weak all at once. "Ma'am," he tried, his voice cracking, "please. That's my seat. First class. 1A, it's on my ticket." Karenna's head turned so fast it startled him. Her eyes were flat, her lips pressed into a thin, humorless line. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just stared, letting the silence stretch unbearably. Then she let out a harsh, derisive little laugh. "Do you have a first-class ticket, really?" she snapped, stressing the word "have" with icy disdain. The words hit Ellis like a slap across the face. He felt the blood rush to his ears. He held up the boarding pass, crumpled and shaking in his fingers, shoving it forward like a shield. "Look," he rasped, his voice raw with humiliation. "It's right here. 1A, I paid for it. Just scan it, please." Karenna didn't move to take it. She didn't even glance at it. Instead, she looked over his shoulder at the thinning line of passengers who had stopped pretending not to watch. She sighed dramatically, her entire body slumping in a performance of weary patience. "I'm sorry, everyone," she said loudly, pitching her voice so it carried well beyond Ellis. "We're just trying to make sure everyone has valid boarding." The word valid dripped with venom, drawing a couple of knowing snickers from the lingering crowd. A young woman in a designer jacket shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, while the businessman from earlier gave a smug little grunt of approval. Ellis felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. His fingers loosened around the ticket slightly, the paper threatening to fall. He tried to speak, but his mouth had gone dry. He could see Karenna's face, how satisfied she looked to see him stammer and wilt. Then Brad Kinney returned, drawn by the rising tension like a shark scenting blood in the water. His steps were slow, deliberate, radiating authority that felt oppressive. He stopped just behind Karenna and let his gaze rake over Ellis with cold disapproval. "Is there still a problem here?" he asked, voice flat and dismissive. Karenna didn't bother to answer him directly. She simply gestured vaguely in Ellis's direction without taking her eyes off the next passenger she was now smiling at. "He's refusing to cooperate," she said in a sing-song tone that sounded almost bored. "Claims he has a first-class ticket." Brad's eyes snapped to Ellis. They were small, dark, and merciless. He didn't ask to see the boarding pass. He didn't ask what had happened. Instead, he reached up to the small intercom microphone attached to the podium and pressed the button with a calm finality that made Ellis's stomach drop. "Security to gate B14, he intoned calmly. "We have a passenger refusing to comply." The words echoed across the gate area. Ellis felt his vision tunnel, his breath coming in fast, shallow gasps. The people around him straightened, craning their necks, their murmurs turning from curiosity to alarm. Some even took small steps back as though he might suddenly lash out. Ellis forced himself to speak, voice rising in panic. "Please, don't do that. I'm not refusing anything. I'm just asking you to scan my ticket." But Brad wasn't listening. He lowered the microphone and gave Ellis a small, satisfied nod. "Sir," he said in a low, warning tone, "you need to calm down and follow directions." Ellis's mouth worked soundlessly. He tried to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Karenna turned away from him with a disgusted sniff that she didn't bother to hide, resuming her bright, professional persona in an instant for the next passenger, the fake sweetness of her voice slicing into him like glass. "Welcome aboard. Sorry for the little delay. Some people just don't understand procedure," she chirped, casting a pointed glance in Ellis's direction without even bothering to hide the sneer in her tone. The man she was checking in, a middle-aged business type with perfect hair and a $200 tie, didn't even look at Ellis. He just stepped forward eagerly, clearly grateful to move past the awkward scene, practically radiating relief that he wasn't the one being held back. Ellis tried to find words, tried to summon enough air to say please one last time, but his tongue felt too thick, his throat too tight, his heart pounding so loud it made his head throb. His ears were ringing so hard he almost didn't hear the sudden crackle of the gate loudspeaker turning on. But the voice that followed was unmistakable, flat, authoritative, designed to project shame across every corner of the waiting area. Ellis Morrow, it intoned with mechanical precision. Please clear the boarding area immediately. This is your final warning. The words punched him in the gut so hard he felt his knees threaten to buckle. He glanced around wildly, blinking rapidly, as if he might find anyone who would protest, who would stand up for him, who would say this wasn't right. But all he saw were averted eyes, turned shoulders, the stubborn refusal of people who didn't want to get involved. A mother with a fussy toddler actually shielded her child's eyes with her hand, like Ellis was some dangerous animal on the other side of the glass. A young man in a varsity jacket shook his head slowly, muttering something under his breath that made the friend next to him snort with mean laughter. He felt every single stare like a lash across his back, each second stretching out into an eternity of raw, suffocating humiliation. Brad Kinney had returned to his spot by the gate counter, arms folded over his broad chest, his expression so smug it made Ellis's stomach turn. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. The announcement had said it all. This man is a problem. This man is not one of us. Get him out. Ellis's mouth trembled as he tried to speak, but all that came out was a ragged exhalation that sounded like a sob he barely managed to choke back. He wanted to scream that he had a ticket, that he had paid just like they did, that all he wanted was to sit in his seat and go home. He wanted to beg them to see him as human, but he couldn't make the words come, because he could see it in their faces. They didn't care. They didn't want to care. Karena's voice floated back to him over the growing murmur of the crowd, this time pitched low, but not low enough to be private. Her tone dripping with exasperated disdain as she leaned toward the young male attendant now helping her at the scanner. Every time, she muttered, loud enough for half the gate to hear, her eyes flicking deliberately to Ellis, and then away as if she couldn't stand the sight of him. Entitlement issues. Every damn time. The words were like acid poured on an open wound. A few people chuckled in quiet agreement, shaking their heads, the sound slicing through Ellis like knives. One man with a silver beard actually tooted and muttered unbelievable under his breath, while his wife gave Ellis a look so cold it could have frozen steel. He watched with a hollow ache as the line of first-class passengers continued to move through the gate, the scanner beeping merrily for them. Karena's voice warm and unctuous in a way it never had been for him. She even handed out chocolate squares from a basket, offering them like peace offerings to people who hadn't even noticed the battle she'd waged at Ellis's expense. His chest tightened as he caught sight of a pair of empty leather seats just beyond the boarding door, visible through the glass as the jet bridge stretched away, mocking him with their smooth, untouched perfection. He knew those seats were unclaimed. He had watched the gate agent check the manifest before, watched the other first-class passengers walk past without claiming them. But they'd said he didn't belong. They'd made him the problem. And now they were going to punish him for daring to ask for what he had paid for. He tried to step forward once more, a desperate surge of determination, pushing him to fight for himself one last time. He held out the wrinkled ticket, voice shaking but loud enough to carry. Please, he managed. Just scan it. It's first class. I paid for it. I paid. Karena didn't even bother to look at him this time. She waved a new group of passengers through, smiling at their small talk, nodding with pretend interest. When he didn't move away immediately, she let out an audible, annoyed sigh and made a little shooing motion with her hand, as if he were an errant child interrupting a dull conversation. Ellis felt heat burn his face so fiercely he thought his skin might peel away. He didn't want to cry here. Not now. But the tears threatened anyway, crowding the edges of his vision. He blinked hard, fighting them back. That's when a new figure approached from behind the counter, cutting between Ellis and Karena with the brisk authority of someone who believed in the righteousness of their own power. Margaret Collins, the shift supervisor. Late 50s, silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes, blazer impeccably pressed and pinned with her name tag at perfect right angles. She didn't smile. She didn't even glance at Ellis as a person. She just flicked her gaze to the boarding pass in his hand and then to Karena's stiff posture and understood instantly which side she was meant to be on. "What's the issue here?" she demanded, her voice so flat and bored it felt like another insult. Karena didn't miss a beat. "He's refusing to wait," she said in a rehearsed tone, as if reading from a policy manual she had memorized for exactly this moment. "Claiming he has first class when he's not on the list. We've had to delay boarding because of it." Ellis's mouth fell open. The words felt like they struck him physically. He almost dropped the ticket. He forced his voice out, raw, hoarse. "It's right here. 1A first class. Please, just look." He thrust it forward. Margaret didn't even reach for it. She crossed her arms, eyebrows rising as if she were disappointed in him before she even heard his side. She let out a short, humorless laugh that made him flinch. "Sir, I'm not going to argue with you," she said crisply. "We don't have any remaining first-class seats." Ellis recoiled like he'd been slapped. His head jerked to the glass again, to those empty seats, shining and perfect in the artificial light. He actually pointed at them, the gesture so desperate it trembled. "They're right there," he choked. "They're empty. I see them. I can take one. Just let me sit down, please." Margaret didn't even look. She just stared at him like he was a stain she couldn't quite scrub away. "I'm sorry," she drawled, her voice dripping with false patience, "but we've already reassigned those for other uses. You're not on the list for first class. I'm offering you economy or nothing." Ellis's mouth moved soundlessly. His eyes darted to Brad, who was still watching from the sidelines with his arms folded, clearly enjoying the show. Brad gave the tiniest shake of his head, as if to warn him off any idea of further protest. Ellis turned back to Margaret, who was checking her watch now, clearly bored with him. He tried again. "Please," he whispered, voice breaking in a way that made him want to vomit with shame. "Please don't do this. I just want to go home." Margaret rolled her eyes, shifting her weight. She spoke slowly now, each word an icy dagger. "Sir, your options are economy class or being removed from the flight entirely. Those are the choices. Make one." The words crushed the last of his resolve. He could feel it snapping inside him like a rotten beam giving way. He wanted to scream that he couldn't afford another flight, that he couldn't afford to waste the money he had poured into this one luxury, this one small moment of being treated like someone who mattered. They'd heard the VP's hissed accusation about the $5.5 billion deal, the words too sharp and raw to be disguised. A mother nearby actually put her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide in shock, while her teenage son whispered, "Holy crap," with a kind of delighted horror that made Ellis's stomach twist. And Karena? She glanced wildly around, her gaze darting between her co-workers, the remaining passengers, and the gate windows as if there might be some escape hatch she could fling herself through. But there was nowhere to go. Her eyes met Ellis's once, just once, and in that moment there was no arrogance left, no authority, nothing but naked fear and shame that made her mouth twitch like she was going to speak but couldn't find words. He didn't look away. He didn't smile. He just watched her the way someone watches a building burn, not with satisfaction, but with grim finality. That was when the first passenger lifted their phone and aimed the camera straight at Karena. Ellis saw the screen glowing, the red record dot blinking. Another did the same, and another. In seconds, the gate area was full of subtle, silent witnesses who realized that this wasn't just an embarrassing scene anymore. It was a story. Someone cleared their throat deliberately and said in a low voice, "Get her on tape. Don't stop recording." The words carried, fueled by a collective hunger for justice that had been slow to wake but was now ravenous. Karena tried to turn away, tried to focus on scanning the next passenger, but her fingers shook so badly she dropped the boarding pass. When she bent to grab it, the woman waiting to board pulled it back and said flatly, "Don't bother. I'll wait for another gate." That small act of rebellion sent a ripple through the crowd. A couple more people stepped back, refusing to go forward. The man in the trench coat who had sneered at Ellis before was now watching Karenna like she was a lab specimen, phone out, recording with the cold intensity of someone who knew they had gold. It wasn't just the passengers at the gate. Behind them, people who hadn't even been in line were holding up phones, lifting them high over heads to catch the scene. A young woman with bright purple hair was narrating softly to her live stream audience, saying, "This airline refused first class to their own VIP client because he's black. Watch this shit." Ellis heard it even from where he stood, leaning heavily on the column, his fingers clutching the economy slip so hard the edges were fraying. His eyes stung with exhausted, unshed tears, but he didn't move. He didn't need to. He had already done his part. The VP returned with Brad in tow, Brad's face ashen and sweating, the man wiping at his brow with shaking fingers as though he could scrub away the guilt. The VP didn't bother with pretense anymore. He strode back to the counter, slammed a palm down on the surface with enough force to make everyone flinch, and barked Karenna's name so loudly it echoed. She snapped to attention, but her face was blotchy with rising panic. The VP didn't care about her expression. He didn't care about anything except fixing what they had done. "Get Mr. Morrow back in first class," he snapped, voice breaking with fury. "Immediately. Apologize. Comp him for the entire flight. Do it now." Karenna's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She was frozen, eyes flicking to Ellis like he might save her. He didn't move. He just stared. The VP turned on Brad next, voice dropping to a deadly calm. "You're on leave. Effective immediately. HR will be in touch." Brad blanched, his mouth working silently like he might protest, but then he caught the sight of the phones recording from every angle and seemed to deflate completely. He didn't even try to speak again. The VP was barking quiet but urgent orders into his headset, pacing behind the counter like a general in a losing war, every so often pausing to glare at Brad or Karenna with naked fury. Ellis didn't move from his spot, didn't flinch or interrupt, didn't gloat or offer comfort. He watched it all with eyes that had seen this before, just never so publicly, never so thoroughly exposed to the world. He felt tired, deeply, bone-deep tired, but there was a small, hard knot of grim satisfaction in his chest that refused to loosen. It was too late for apologies, too late for easy fixes. He could see it on their faces, the dawning realization that the damage was already done. Across the terminal, people were showing each other the videos, letting the clips autoplay with the volume off, but the captions unmistakable. "He's making things difficult," read one, Karenna's voice recorded in full. Clear disdain as she dismissed Ellis's boarding pass. "Do you have a first-class ticket really?" read another, her sneering tone preserved forever. "And the worst, we have real customers waiting," her sarcasm captured and shared by hundreds, thousands, now millions. Notifications pinged relentlessly. Even Ellis's old phone buzzed in his pocket, vibrating with missed calls and messages he wasn't ready to check yet. He watched a man in a suit at the edge of the crowd scroll through his feed, stop on the headline that had already gone viral, and muttered "Jesus Christ" under his breath before turning and walking away, shaking his head. The VP was now standing at the counter, shoulders hunched, fingers pinching the bridge of his nose as he listened to a frantic voice on his earpiece. He glanced up and made direct eye contact with Karenna, and something in his face hardened into ice. He didn't raise his voice, but the quiet authority was so final it felt like a guillotine blade dropping. "Karen Doyle, you are suspended, effective immediately. Hand over your badge." The words fell like stones in a pond, rippling out to the assembled passengers, the staff, the security guard who was now shifting uncomfortably by the entrance, all of them frozen by the sound of real power being exercised. Karenna's mouth fell open. She let out a tiny, strangled sob, fingers flying to the shiny brass badge pinned over her breast pocket, the same badge she had adjusted so proudly before dismissing Ellis. Her hand trembled as she unpinned it, the metal slipping once and clattering on the counter with a dull, humiliating thud. She picked it up with shaking fingers and handed it over. "Please," she whispered, but the VP didn't even blink. He just nodded at the security guard. "Escort her out. Now." The guard, who had nearly thrown Ellis out an hour ago, now approached Corinna instead, his expression carefully blank, one hand resting on the radio at his hip. She tried to say something else, voice cracking on the first syllable, but he simply motioned her toward the exit. The two of them began the slow, humiliating walk down the terminal, her shoulders hunched, the gathered passengers parting for them like a funeral procession. Phones followed every step. Brad's turn came next. He tried to rally himself, puffing out his chest slightly as if he might salvage his authority. But the VP didn't even let him speak. "Brad Kinney," he said coldly, "you're done. Pack your things. HR will be in touch about your separation. Effective immediately." Brad's mouth worked for a second like he might object, but he must have felt the eyes on him, the cameras trained on his pale, sweating face, because he finally let his arms drop to his sides. He gave Ellis a single, miserable glance before looking away, not a word of apology offered. The VP didn't bother watching him leave. He was already on his phone, speaking in tight, urgent syllables to someone Ellis couldn't see. But even from where he stood, Ellis heard enough to know the cancer in the company wasn't limited to these two. "Yes, sir," the VP hissed into the phone. "I understand. Yes. Press releases are being drafted now. Names will be included. Yes, the board is meeting in emergency session. I know exactly what they're going to ask for." He paused, listening, face tightening, and finally nodded. "Yes. Resignations. Multiple. I'll make sure they're ready." Ellis Morrow watched from the back of the conference room, arms folded loosely across his chest, the stale institutional coffee steaming gently on the table in front of him, untouched. The place was bright and modern, with glass walls, neutral art on the walls, and a giant screen mounted at the front. On that screen was paused a still frame he'd seen more times than he wanted to remember. Corinna Doyle's face frozen in mid-sneer, mouth twisted, eyes filled with that awful mixture of pity and disdain, the words at the bottom of the screen in big, bold captions. "We have real customers waiting." He didn't flinch at the sight of it anymore. He had learned not to. He had made himself watch it enough times that the sting had dulled into something sharper, harder, more useful. The room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the small, stifled sounds of people shifting in their seats, clearing throats, avoiding each other's eyes. He could see the discomfort roll over them in waves, especially when they realized he was there. The training facilitator, a woman named Yvette with decades of HR experience and an expression that brooked no nonsense, stood at the front with a remote in her hand. She looked at the group seated in their neat semicircle of chairs, flight attendants, supervisors, gate agents, managers, all wearing company lanyards and forced expressions of corporate contrition. Corinna was there too, seated at the end of the row, shoulders hunched, hair less perfectly styled than it had been at the gate that day. She wouldn't meet Ellis's eyes. She hadn't yet. Yvette cleared her throat and clicked the remote. The video started again. Ellis's voice came through the speakers first, brittle and quiet, but unmistakable. "Please. It's first class. 1A, it's on my ticket." Then Corinna's voice followed, sharp and dismissive, dripping with that sickly sweet poison they all recognized too well. "Do you have a first-class ticket, really?" Someone in the room flinched visibly. A man in the second row muttered "Jesus" under his breath before clamping his mouth shut, cheeks red. The clip continued without mercy. Corinna gesturing for him to back up. Corinna's sarcastic, "We have real customers waiting." Brad's bored voice threatening to call security. Ellis refusing to move, voice cracking. And finally, the damning overhead announcement, delivered in that robotic voice that had echoed in his nightmares for weeks afterward. "Ellis Morrow, please clear the boarding area immediately." When the video ended, the room sat in heavy silence. No one moved. No one dared to speak first. Yvette let it breathe for a long moment before she broke the silence. "This is what it looks like," she said calmly. "This is what it sounds like. I want you all to sit with that. Really sit with it." Her gaze swept the room, daring anyone to look away. Corinna had her head in her hands now. Her shoulders shook once, twice, and then the tears came in earnest, loud enough that the person next to her reached out a hand awkwardly, but didn't quite dare to touch her. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheek. When she finally lifted her head, she looked straight at Ellis, eyes red and raw. He didn't look away. She swallowed hard, voice broken. "I didn't think," she whispered hoarsely. I didn't think he was supposed to be there." The words were small, but they filled the room like a confession. No one interrupted her. Ellis didn't move, didn't nod, didn't forgive. He just listened. Karenna sucked in a wet breath and tried again, the words tumbling over each other. "I thought I was protecting the other passengers. I thought I was doing my job." She broke down again, burying her face in her hands. Ellis felt something heavy shift in his chest, not pity exactly, but something like exhausted understanding. He had seen this moment coming. He had asked for it. In fact, when the airline's lawyers and PR people had come crawling to him after the disaster went viral, begging him to settle quietly, to make the headlines go away, he'd refused. He'd had demands instead. This was one of them. Not money, not a check to make him disappear, but this room, this moment. These people forced to see exactly what they had done, forced to watch it until they couldn't look away. Yvette didn't comfort Karenna. She let the tears happen. When they subsided, she gestured toward Ellis without saying his name, as if everyone didn't know. "This is what bias looks like," she said quietly. "It's not always shouting slurs. Sometimes it's politeness with an edge. Sometimes it's assuming someone doesn't belong. Sometimes it's humiliating them in public so everyone else feels safer." She turned back to the group. "You all need to decide if that's the kind of company you want to work for. Because it's not going to be this company anymore." There were nods, some hesitant, some firm. Ellis let out a slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. This wasn't easy. It wasn't even satisfying. But it felt necessary. The airline hadn't had a choice. After the videos went viral, after the stock price dropped 15% in 2 days, after the board forced the CEO and 2 vice presidents to resign on live television, they had to do something real. They had to rebuild. And they had come to him to help them figure out how. He hadn't done it to save them. He had done it so it wouldn't happen to someone else. That was why he'd offered his foundation's help, the nonprofit he'd started years ago, to combat this exact sort of quiet, insidious discrimination. They had agreed, of course. Publicly, breathlessly. They'd announced the partnership in a press conference Ellis hadn't even attended. They'd sent out glossy releases with his picture next to their new CEO, smiling like they were best friends. He hadn't smiled in that picture. He'd looked tired, honest. Today was the first of many sessions, mandatory for all customer-facing staff, recorded, audited, transparent, paid for by the company's board-approved budget, a permanent line item now. Ellis felt the weight of the room's silence settle around him like a second skin. He didn't want their thanks. He didn't want their tears. He wanted them to change. That was all. Finally, Yvette clicked the remote again and the screen went black. She looked at Ellis. "Do you want to say anything?" The question was gentle, careful, but the weight of authority in it was clear. He swallowed once, then straightened up from the wall. The room's eyes turned to him. He met them all, one by one, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable again. Then he spoke, voice even, words measured but ringing clear in the quiet. "I didn't want to be here," he said flatly. "I never wanted to be here. I didn't want my name trending. I didn't want your stock to drop. I didn't want to become your lesson plan." He let the words sink in. Karenna flinched, but she didn't look away this time. "I just wanted to sit in the seat I paid for," Ellis continued, softer now, but no less clear. "Like anyone else." He paused, breathing evenly. Then he gave them the only thing he could, the truth. If you can't let someone do that without making them feel small, then you shouldn't be doing this job. Silence again, heavy, honest. Yvette finally nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Morrow." He didn't respond. He just turned and walked out of the room, leaving them to sit with the echo of his words and the black screen that still held the ghost of Karenna's frozen sneer. The end. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love it if you gave it a like and hit subscribe so you don't miss future chapters and stories. I want to hear from you. What did you think of the plot? Did the twists land for you? How did the ending make you feel? Drop a comment and tell me your thoughts. And hey, where are you watching from today? Let's see who's joining us from around the world. Share your city or country below. I'd love to know where this story is reaching.